Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. I hope everyone has been enjoying their holidays. I know I have. It's good to be back. And while I was gone late last Thursday night, just before the long holiday weekend, as everyone was immersed in their preparations for it, the January 6th committee went ahead and did it. They published and released the long-awaited final report, product of 18 months of work, nearly 1,000 pages long. The parts that I have read are shocking and revelatory, laying out the crimes of Donald J. Trump and his co-conspirators in a clear and dramatic fashion. Crimes for which one of the authors of the report, Congressman Jamie Raskin, told an interviewer Trump, quote, could spend the remaining days of his misanthropic life behind bars, presumably with Secret Service agents. It's sort of a crazy image to imagine, a fairly bold statement from someone who is usually fairly measured. So what in the report makes Raskin say that? Given the holiday and the sheer volume of material, those of us who haven't read through it all can be forgiven. I assume, maybe I'm wrong, that you're in the same boat I am. And that's why we've decided to spend this week going through the final report here with legal experts who have read it closely. Now, there's obviously a ton of information we're going to get to throughout the week, but we want to start tonight with a particularly revealing section. It's not the first one. In fact, it's chapter 5, which is titled A Coup in Search of a Legal Theory. Now, that title is important because it outlines exactly what Donald Trump and his allies were doing in the days leading up to January 6th. The point is, they had an end result in mind, a coup, the first in American history, the first time that the sitting president would overturn the will of the voters. They wanted to declare the loser of the 2020 election, Donald Trump, as its winner. How to do it? Well, in order to do so, they manufactured a bogus legal strategy to justify that conclusion. And that bogus legal strategy was known to be bogus to the key players, including this man, the man who's at the center of it all, a strategy that was concocted largely by this individual, Trump lawyer John Eastman. Now, we have mentioned him countless times. We've covered him closely on the show because he was such a key player in this entire undertaking. Eastman claimed that then Vice President Mike Pence had the authority to essentially, unilaterally, by himself, as if endowed with supreme power, throw out the results of the election, essentially, to just say, no, I don't accept it, and install Trump as a winner instead on January 6th. Members of Trump's own inner circle, lawyer after lawyer after lawyer in the White House and around Trump, called it, quote, insane, crazy, and nutty. And what's clear in the final report is that Eastman and Trump, as kind of partners in this undertaking, knew the theory was bogus, that the strategy was plainly illegal all along. There was no good faith confusion, no arguable, colorable case on both sides, no. In the presence of Pence, Eastman even acknowledged the plan was unlawful. And yet both he and Trump relentlessly pressured the vice president to follow the illegal plan on January 6th. That is, to break the law in a fashion they knew would be broken and thereby break American democracy itself. At one point, and this is really a key part of this chapter, at one point, Trump sympathetic Congressman Louis Gohmert of Texas tries to file a lawsuit in which he takes Eastman's own theory and argues it in court. He wants to argue Eastman's own theory of Pence's powers. So what does John Eastman do? Eastman himself lobbied against the Gohmert suit because he rightly expected a judge to declare Pence had no such powers, as was obvious to anyone looking at the situation. In other words, Eastman didn't want it tested in court because he knew it would fail. He didn't want a ruling on its legality because he knew it was illegal. He knew exactly what he was doing. That said, Eastman and Trump, knowing that, in tandem, pushed the bogus legal theory anyway, both in the media and directly to Mike Pence himself, who faced enormous pressure to go along with the scheme. To his credit, he did not. That doesn't change the fact that in just one of many examples, Trump and his fellow coup plotters tried to criminally subvert the will of the American people and potentially end American democracy as we know it. Joyce Vance served as U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama. She is now a distinguished professor at the University of Alabama Law School. And Renato Mariani is a former federal prosecutor and a legal affairs columnist for Politico magazine. I know both of you have read this chapter of the report closely and have a lot of thoughts on it. I am just getting up to speed, so it is great to have you here. I want to start on this point and then we'll broaden out, because I do think this is a bit of a smoking gun. as pertains to the state of mind of Mr. Eastman. And I'm just going to read about the Gohmert suit here and get your reaction to what do you think it indicates. Reading from the report, one of the President Trump's congressional allies, Representative Louis Gohmert, pushed a version of Eastman's theory in the courts. Although the Gohmert suit was premised on the same theory Eastman advocated, Eastman did not agree with the decision to file suit. Eastman argued that filing a suit against the vice president had close to zero chance of succeeding, and there was a very high risk the court would issue an opinion stating that Pence had no authority to reject the Biden certified ballots. Joyce, what does that say to you about the nature of Eastman's knowledge and corrupt intent with regards to this legal theory?
Eastman knew, Chris, it's exactly the way that you explain it. He knew that that legal theory could not hold up in court. He knew that the vice president wasn't what they called the president of the Senate, really the dictator of the American people, right? The guy who can throw out all of the legitimate ballots and declare the winner to be whoever he wants it to be. So the theory was a non-starter, and that's what happened. A federal judge threw out Gohmert's case. The Supreme Court refused to take it up. What Eastman is really doing here is sort of this insurrection version of the adage that many government employees use. It's easier to ask for forgiveness, to beg for forgiveness, than to ask for permission. He knew that if he asked for permission in advance, he would be told no. This is not a sustainable approach. And so what Eastman was doing, and by extension Trump, they were trying to play it out for as long as possible to keep alive this notion that the vice president could take the responsibility for throwing the election into controversy, hoping that, as they always did, they could take advantage of the chaos.
Renato, Eastman's role in this chapter is, well, it comes across as more willfully malevolent than any other comprehensive characterization of his actions. What was your takeaway about Eastman's specific role and his specific culpability?
Well, one thing is, I think, absolutely certain is that, as Joyce said a minute ago, Eastman knew that this theory was bogus. He also, at times, made false statements, and it was clear to me from reading the report that he wanted false statements to be made in relation to the scheme. I mean, one thing that is really important that's mentioned many times in this chapter, Chris, is that the actual electors themselves weren't actually submitted by the states. So there was actually no colorable argument that these states had actually submitted an alternative slate of electors. And yet Eastman was trying to get the vice president to say something false about that. And so it just goes to show that he had a scheme to try to, whether you call it defraud the United States or make a false statement in a federal proceeding. These are crimes that are prosecuted on a regular basis. And that's why Eastman, for example, has his phone seized by the United States Department of Justice.
Wait, just to follow up on that, when you say Eastman wanted to make Pence to make a false statement, what was that? Explain that.
He wanted Pence to say that there were competing slates of electors in these states. The problem that Eastman had is the states themselves refused to do it. I mean, we all heard Rusty Bowers, for example, from Arizona, who testified to the committee saying he refused that. That is discussed in this chapter, but other states as well. As the committee put it in the report, those state officials upheld their oaths and were unwilling to certify fake electors. And so essentially, the statement he was asking Mike Pence to make was, in fact, false on its face, regardless of the legal theory.
This is such an important point, Joyce, that Renato makes there that really comes through in the chapter is they tried it to do it at the state level, right? What they wanted, the original plan, which was slightly more defensible, although obviously still essentially an insurrection, right? Essentially a coup, was to get the states themselves to send competing electors. That never happened. And so they still tried to run the play, even though that first part had never happened, which, to Renato's point, there does seem like clear violations of law in attempting to do it anyway and attempting to get Mike Pence to do it anyway.
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. And the whole story here, this is a whole trajectory about trying to use the big lie about voter fraud to somehow overcome the result of the election. And so Trump, I think about it as a funnel. At the big end, you have Trump filing all these crazy lawsuits, trying to get state election officials to overturn their own results. And everyone is saying, no, we're not going to do that. That's the wrong thing to do. They try to go to DOJ and get DOJ to put its gravitas behind the voter fraud theory. DOJ refuses. And now we're down to just the last few days before the certification of the vote. And Trump is really down to two strategies. One is Mike Pence and one is outright insurrection. And so everything becomes focused on Mike Pence because these efforts with state electors have failed. To your point, Chris, whether or not there are crimes that are committed along the way, the statute that we've all heard a lot of talk about and that the committee referred on, this interference, this obstruction of an official proceeding statute appears to be almost tailor-made for the conduct that occurred on January 6th.
Yeah, and obviously one of the other key
conduct that occurred on January 6th.
Yeah, and obviously one of the other key elements of this chapter, right, is that Eastman rises to this level because he is doing what Trump wants. He and Trump are a team here. He's essentially executing on Trump's vision. In some ways, he's guiding him. There appears to be pretty strong evidence in this chapter of a one-on-one call of about 25 minutes, particularly about this. So I want to talk about Trump's culpability and his relationship to. We're beginning our deep dive into the January 6th final report tonight with a look at Chapter 5, a chapter that indicates the ex-president and his lawyer, John Eastman, worked in tandem, essentially a kind of pair, to push a ridiculous coup plot that they knew all along violated the law in order to keep Donald Trump in power against the will of the voters. According to the committee, it was, quote, a coup in search of a legal theory, the legal theory being provided by Mr. Eastman. Still with me, former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, former federal prosecutor Renato Mariotti. So I want to talk about the sort of unique role that Eastman plays in tandem with Trump, Renato. And there's a remarkable moment that's almost sociopathic, honestly, on the 6th. And really, it's striking in the report because there's really only two people in the entire country, aside from participants in the mob, who seem unbothered by the mob's actions: Donald Trump and John Eastman. John Eastman writes an email after the attack to the general counsel for the vice president, Greg Jacob, basically being like, well, the 2-hour window of debate under law has now been breached. So throw the law out, the vice president can do whatever he wants. He says, in a shockingly tone-deaf manner, Eastman claimed the Electoral Count Act had been violated already by allowing debate beyond 2 hours. So he argued Vice President Pence should no longer be concerned that what President Trump and Eastman had pressured him to do also would violate it. This really jumped out to me, Renato, almost as a sort of character evidence about who John Eastman was and how he was operating in tandem with Trump at this time.
Yeah, there's a word lawyers use sometimes, disingenuous. It's a very polite lawyer way of saying that somebody's full of crap. And I think Mr. Eastman here was very disingenuous because what he was essentially telling Pence for all this time is, I know that this violates the Electoral Count Act, and you can just totally disregard it. That law, yes, it's on the books. Yes, it's been on the books for a long time, but you can just ignore this and hatch my scheme that violates the act. And then when there's literally a violent attack, assault on the Capitol that for understandable reasons is delaying the proceedings, he then tries to make the argument, well, now that the Electoral Count Act has been violated, you can just set it aside. It's obviously dishonest and disingenuous on his part.
And one thing that is made very clear in this chapter of the report, Joyce, is that Eastman there's no reason for John Eastman to be talking to the President of the United States, to be meeting with various members of the White House legal staff, from the Vice President to the President, to be speaking at the January 6th rally. He's not a campaign attorney in any official sense. He doesn't work in the White House. He is simply essentially the one lawyer in America who is giving Donald Trump what he wants, which is some legal pretext for a coup. Ultimately, he is an agent of Trump in all of this as it lays out. What does that mean for Trump's culpability legally?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And there's an interesting piece of information earlier in the report, Chris, where the committee nails down the fact that Trump rejects his campaign lawyers, his normal slate of lawyers, because they won't help him with the big lie. And ultimately, he gives entree to the Rudy Giuliani crew. And John Eastman emerges as the guy here who has legitimate legal chops. He's clerked, he's well known in the legal community, and he is willing to pursue this theory that is contrary to the law, but that serves Trump's purposes. And there's at least one meeting where Trump is present on the 5th, where he hears Eastman concede that the theory won't hold up in court, that it's not accurate. So for the entire period of time where Trump is out vilifying Mike Pence, calling, for instance, on the morning of the 6th for Pence to toe the line and do what Trump wants him to do, Trump knows that it's not legal. In terms of Trump's culpability, again, if we talk about the notion of interfering or obstructing an official proceeding, which is just one of the possible charges, this all suggests that he had the state of mind, the knowledge and the intent to obstruct that's essential to bringing that sort of a case. I guess the one thing that I would say is the committee doesn't operate under the same constraints DOJ does. They don't have to worry about whether evidence is admissible. So some of this might be hearsay and not admissible in court. DOJ has other considerations, including how well witnesses will hold up under cross-examination and what defenses Trump might offer. Nonetheless, there is every reason to believe here that there is a case for DOJ to move forward with.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I was thinking about as I was reading through the chapter this afternoon was these two individuals, Donald Trump and John Eastman, have already been identified by a federal district judge in a motion around privilege to have more likely than not to have committed a crime, specifically in what they undertook together in this pursuit. This is a judge in the Southern California District Court who said, based on the evidence, the court finds it more likely than not that President Trump and Dr. Eastman dishonestly conspired to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021. So you have already, before this report, Renato, a federal judge saying, yeah, there's something here. It's not beyond a shadow of beyond a reasonable doubt. The question then, I guess, becomes is there evidence that exists that DOJ could get, the committee could not, and how necessary or relevant that would be?
I'm really glad you asked that, Chris, because there's a really important missing piece here, which is what Pat Cipollone told Donald Trump. If you read Chapter 5, there's a discussion, for example, of a meeting where Cipollone was excluded from the meeting, but they don't know, the committee doesn't know exactly why, because Cipollone refused to answer questions on this subject because of executive privilege. He refused to say what advice he gave Trump, what he told Trump privately about this. And those are all questions that we know the Justice Department is going to be able to ask Cipollone pursuant to a grand jury subpoena. We also know they've done so. In other words, they have gone and obtained that testimony and got the court order that they need. And he has, in fact, testified. And so I expect their initial questions where they have a blueprint from this committee is, what did you say to Donald Trump? What knowledge did you put in his head? What did he say in response? Pat Cipollone could very well be the most important witness to get done.
It's a really, really good point. That was extremely, extremely useful and edifying for me. Joyce Vance, Renato Mariotti, thank you both for joining us tonight. Really, really appreciate it. Up next, Congress quietly passes a fix to some of the loopholes that Trump and Eastman tried to exploit. But is it enough to prevent another coup? That's ahead. The key pressure points, perhaps the key pressure point that John Eastman and Donald Trump together tried to attack on January 6th was created by the 135-year-old Electoral Count Act. It's a piece of legislation that governs precisely how Congress counts presidential electors, how they elect the president. It was passed a decade after the contested election of 1876. Now, it had all kinds of problems that have long endured because nobody thought to exploit them in this fashion until basically John Eastman and Donald Trump. But now, thanks to a series of provisions that were tucked away in that omnibus spending bill Congress passed last week, the Electoral Count Act, the thing that gave them this little bit of daylight to try to push through, that has been reformed with the clear intention of making sure that neither Donald Trump nor anybody else can use it to ever try to overturn an election again. Joining me now is Rick Hassan, professor of law and political science at UCLA, founder of the election law blog, who has been calling consistently and loudly for Reform Electoral Count Act. Rick, this has been something we've talked about this program. It's been something you've been talking about. A lot of folks, election law advocates and experts. What do you make of what Congress did last week in that omnibus spending bill?
Well, it's both absolutely necessary that it happened and also remarkable that it happened. It took the last minute. It was the very last thing that Congress voted on before they left, but they got it done. And it's a considerable improvement over what we had. The last law from 1887 was incomprehensible in parts. And it did have these ambiguities that Donald Trump tried to exploit and that could have been exploited again in the future. So it's really good news. And we don't always have a lot of good news, so it's worth highlighting it.
So just a very quick version, right? In the 1876 election is Tilden versus Hayes. It's very close. It's disputed. There are competing slates of electors that happen. Ultimately, a kind of political compromise that gets worked out, which involves the Union withdrawing its troops from the South and basically ending federal Reconstruction. 10 years later, they passed this law to try to clean up the mess that was exposed by 1876, but make their own kind of mess. How far does this go to making it not possible for Trump to try to do what he did on January 6th?
Well, the precise things he tried to do would be much harder. So trying to get the legislatures to come in and come up with an alternative slate of electors on grounds that there was a failed election, that's gone. Trying to get Mike Pence to unilaterally throw out electoral college votes as having some kind of special powers, that's gone. And it deals also with new things. For example, if we would have had a Doug Mastriano or a Kerry Lake as a governor of a state trying to send in a fake slate of electors, it provides for judicial review going all the way to the Supreme Court to try to stop that. So, lots of the things that we were worried about before are gone. That doesn't mean that there aren't ways to try to exploit all of this, including one of the things that John Eastman had said, which is all of the, he had said the Electoral Count Act is unconstitutional. And, I could imagine John Eastman saying this one is too, and the Congress can do whatever it wants. So it's not as though this law is a total shield, but it's much, much better than what we had before.
Does it also, am I correct here that it it raises the bar for objections as well? The sort of old bar for objections was fairly low, right? You just had to get a senator, if I'm recalling this correctly, which made it pretty easy to object to a given state's electors, which is what gave us, Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz and Rick Scott and these others who were said, like, we'll join you, House members. That created the sort of false sense of suspense of, will they vote down the slate? That bar for objecting to a state's electors has been raised. Am I right about that?
Right. So it was one senator and one representative. Now it's 20%. So it's a big bar. One of the things that the House bill would have done was it would have had a list of the kinds of reasons for objecting. That's not in there. But this is still an improvement. But remember how many House members were willing to sign on to objections. I think it was something like 143 that objected when it came to Pennsylvania after the insurrection happened. So 20% sounds high, but when you're in the throes of trying to overturn an election result, things are still possible. So again, it's not fail-safe, but it's a lot better and gets rid of the frivolous grandstanding at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, this gets to a deeper question here, right? Which is the nature of democratic breakdown and where you locate its cause, right? I mean, the Electoral Count Act and its ambiguity certainly didn't help, but ultimately it's the willful malevolence of the person who's lost an election and has state power who's trying to marshal it to stay in office. That's the ultimate cause, and that's going to be there no matter what statutory language is around.
Oh, sure. Right. So in addition to something like a person like Eastman saying this new act is unconstitutional, if Trump had been able to use the Insurrection Act or activate the military, then all bets are off. There's no silver bullet, right? But this makes it harder, and it gets rid of that veneer of legality. I mean, that's what we saw that John Eastman trying to do, was to try to claim, oh, look at what Thomas Jefferson did. Like there's some way in to make a claim that this is not just a total power play against American democracy. It's harder to do that now.
Yeah, I mean, the final note I would just make here, and I'm basically stealing this from my very brilliant wife, Kate Shaw, who wrote about this, is that it also just exposes the sort of ridiculous Rube Goldbergian mechanisms of the Electoral College itself and all the complicated ways we have to produce the president when a very, very straightforward and simple means to do that exists, which is the means we use for basically every other election, which is to count the votes, and the person with more votes then gets the office. We could just do that here. Of course, we would require a constitutional amendment to do that. But that to me is the ultimate goal. Rick Hasen, thanks for making time tonight. Really appreciate it.